The sun was bleeding itself out over Red Canyon when Elias Colter heard the wire sing. A thin metallic hum ran down the fence line, carried by the wind from the southern ridge. He set his tin cup down, steam curling into the cooling air, and turned his head just enough to catch the sound again. It wasn't loud, but it was wrong. He rose from the porch with the slow precision of a man who'd lived too long to waste a sudden move. The cup stayed on the rail, its rim catching a sliver of dying light. Out on the canyon's edge, shadows stretched long and sharp, swallowing the last strip of gold from the day. Elias stepped into the yard, boots scuffing the dry ground. His eyes swept the horizon, noting the way the mesquite branches leaned, the way dust lifted from the south instead of the west. He crouched, pressing 2 fingers into the powdery soil beside the gate. Old tracks, his own, scuffed and wide. Nothing fresh. He rose again, ears working harder than his eyes. The fence wire stilled, as if it hadn't spoken at all. He turned back toward the cabin, passing the charred notch in the porch post. Fire had chewed it 10 years ago, the same night it had taken Margaret and their boy, Daniel. He didn't linger there. Memory had edges he'd learned not to hold too tight. But some nights a line of scripture still came unbidden. "The Lord has forsaken me, my Lord has forgotten me." Inside, the small kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds and dust. A pair of clean tin cups sat beside the stove. 2, though only one had been used in years. He picked them both up and carried them out to the porch. 2 chairs waited there as well, side by side, their wood silvered by sun and time. One gathered dust each day, and each evening he brushed it clean. He settled into the other, the familiar creak under his weight. Beyond the canyon, the red rock blushed deeper under the retreating sun. Somewhere out there, a quail flushed from cover, its wing beats sharp against the wind. That was when he heard it. Not the wire this time, a murmur, almost swallowed by the air. He froze, tilting his head. Another sound followed, faint, uneven, breath, not wind, human. Elias set his cup down again, the coffee gone cold. He stood and moved to the corral where his mare waited, her ears flicking toward the ridge. He saddled her without hurry, but without waste. Cinch checked, rifle slipped into its scabbard, canteen looped onto the horn. He added a roll of bandage and the small tin of sage salve he kept for colts that tangled in barbed wire. The light was dropping fast as he rode out. The southern ridge lay half in shadow, the rocks catching the last flare of crimson. He kept his mare to a steady walk, hooves muffled in the sandy trail. The canyon below breathed cool air up toward him, carrying the faint scent of creosote after a long day's heat. The sound came again, a thin thread in the growing dark. He turned the mare toward it, guiding her down through a gap in the brush. The path narrowed, branches scratching at his sleeves. He found her under a twisted mesquite, curled on her side like a bird knocked from its nest. Her dress was torn, dust and dry leaves tangled in black hair. One ankle lay at an odd angle, already swelling against the leather of her moccasin. Elias swung down from the saddle, letting the reins fall loose so the mare would stay. His hands were open, palms out, the way you approach a spooked animal. "Easy," he said, voice low from years of disuse. The woman's eyes flicked up to him, dark, wary, and clouded with pain. She didn't speak. He unhooked his canteen, unscrewed the cap, and held it toward her. For a moment she hesitated. Then she took it, drank once, and let it fall against her chest. He didn't ask who she was or how she'd come to be there. Some answers could wait. Instead, he crouched beside her, checking the ankle with careful fingers. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms, light as dry grass, and set her across the saddle. Leading the mare by the reins, he started back toward the cabin, the first stars cutting through the last of the dusk. Behind them, the canyon swallowed the sound of their leaving. Ahead, 2 empty chairs waited on the porch, though tonight maybe only one would be empty. The porch light spilled a narrow stripe across the packed dirt as Elias pushed open the cabin door with his boot. He stepped inside sideways, keeping his grip on the woman steady, letting the warmth from the stove reach her before the smell of wood smoke did. He set her down on the old couch against the far wall, the springs sighing under her weight. Her eyes flickered around the small room, stove in one corner, shelves lined with jars of coffee and beans, the rifle rack above the mantel. Nothing here moved without his say-so, and she seemed to understand that. Elias crouched by the hearth, coaxing the fire higher. From a tin on the shelf, he took the sage salve, unscrewed the lid, and let the sharp scent fill the air. "This'll sting," he said, unwrapping the strip of cloth he kept for mending more than horses. She didn't answer, but her gaze stayed on his hands as he worked. He cleaned the cuts on her shin, wrapped the ankle tight but not cruel, and pressed the salve in with the slow, even care of a man who knew where hurt lived. When he tied off the last knot, he set her foot gently on a folded blanket. From the stove, he ladled beans into a tin bowl and cut a slice from a loaf of bread. He placed both on the low table beside her, then stepped back toward the door. The chair outside was waiting, and he took it, facing the canyon while she ate in the quiet behind him. The wind had shifted again, pushing from the north. He listened for anything riding its back, hoofbeats, the creak of leather, but heard only the restless murmur of the desert. Behind him, the scrape of the bowl against the table. A pause, then a voice, low and careful. "Nalin." It was the first word she'd offered. Elias turned his head, just enough to see her in the doorway, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was shadowed, but her eyes caught what little light a lamp gave. "Elias," he said. She nodded once. That was all. She went back inside, leaving the door open to the night. He stayed out there another hour, watching the stars come forward one by one. Somewhere down in the canyon, a coyote called. He thought about closing the door, then didn't. In the morning, the sun climbed up the canyon walls in slow gold. Elias was already moving, feeding the mare, checking the fence line near the cabin, looking for anything the night had brought in. Nalin was still on the couch, the blanket pulled tight, eyes half-lidded but watchful. When he set a tin cup of water on the table beside her, she murmured something in her own tongue. He didn't ask what it meant. Over the next days, she stayed put. Sometimes she slept. Sometimes she watched the fire as if it held a story only she could read. Elias kept the food simple, but he noticed when she began adding to it. Sprigs of something from outside, roots he didn't recognize but that filled the air with new scents. He never asked where she found them. A man didn't question another's ways if they brought warmth to the table. By the fourth day, she could stand, leaning on the arm of the couch. She didn't touch anything she hadn't been given, didn't move more than she had to. When he found her by the door one evening, gazing out toward the canyon, he realized the blanket around her shoulders was the same one Margaret had sewn. Nalin must have chosen it herself. That night, he put the second chair back in its place beside his on the porch. He didn't mention it, and she didn't sit in it. But when he rose before dawn to check the horizon, there were 2 cups cooling on the rail instead of one. He didn't smile, not outright, but something inside shifted, like the first crack in a long drought cloud. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. Morning light found its way into the cabin in thin gold stripes, cutting across the floorboards and the blanket draped over Nalin's shoulders. Elias had been outside since before dawn, running the usual loop, feeding the mare, checking the corral, walking the fence line closest to the canyon edge. He stepped back in with the scent of mesquite still on him. She was sitting up now, legs tucked beneath her, watching the fire. When she turned her head toward him, there was a quiet steadiness in her eyes. "Nalin," she said again, as if to make it official. "Elias," he replied. No extra words. He set a tin cup of water on the table within her reach, then leaned his rifle against the wall by the door. She lifted the cup with both hands, took a slow sip, and set it back down without a sound. Her gaze moved over the room, pausing on small things. A coil of rope hung just so on the wall. The row of clean coffee tins. The chipped enamel basin by the stove. She didn't touch anything, but she studied it like a map. When he stepped toward the stove to check the kettle, he caught her eyes flick toward the counter. A pot and skillet had been shifted since last night, moved closer together. His stores of beans and flour were stacked tighter, as if she'd measured the space and adjusted for use. The wash basin sat under the spout with a small dipper inside, positioned to catch every drop of water without spill. He didn't comment. Years of living alone had taught him the value of quiet observation, and he could see she lived by the same rule. Later, when he went out to the porch to sand a rough patch on the rifle stock, he heard the faint screep of metal from inside. Peering through the open doorway, he saw her by the stove, rearranging the few utensils into a tighter bundle, handle ends all pointed the same way. The pot lid had been set upside down on top of the pot, a trick he knew kept heat in longer, saving fuel. These were the habits of someone who'd gone long stretches without enough to waste. He recognized them because he'd done the same after the fire, rationing coffee, stretching nails until they bent twice before breaking. When he stepped back inside, she moved away from the stove without a word, taking her place again by the couch. She glanced at the door, then at the window, noting the way the light came in. It was a small thing, but Elias caught it. The deliberate way she placed herself where she could see both openings without moving her head much. By the third week, the ankle was better, but still wrapped. She walked slow, using the edge of the table for balance. The banged-up moccasin sat on the hearth, drying from a scrub she'd given it. Elias came in from the corral one afternoon to find the basin filled with clean water and the counter wiped down. Not just wiped, cleaned with sand until the wood grain showed. He noticed something else, too. The broom, normally leaning in the corner, had been propped beside the back door. From there, you could sweep tracks in the dirt outside, either to hide them or to make them. Nalin looked up from where she was sitting cross-legged by the hearth, crushing dried leaves into a small cloth pouch. Her hands moved with the same economy as her steps. Elias didn't ask about the leaves. Instead, he sat at the table pouring himself a coffee. He didn't need to hear the story to understand the shape of it. People didn't learn those habits without reason, and people who had reason to learn them usually had reason to keep moving. He took a slow drink, letting the bitter heat settle in his chest, and glanced at the second cup on the counter. Still clean, still waiting. By the fourth week, Nalin's limp was less pronounced. She still kept the ankle wrapped, but she moved around the cabin without leaning on the furniture. One afternoon, Elias came in from checking the north fence and found the room scented with something sharp and green. She was at the stove, stirring a small pot, steam curling around her face. The counter held sprigs of creosote, a cluster of wild sage, and a handful of mint leaves he hadn't seen in years. "Found these near the wash," she said without looking up. He stepped closer, picking up a sage sprig. It was clean, trimmed. Whoever had gathered it knew how to take only what the plant could give without killing it. The pot bubbled low, releasing a scent that filled more than just the air. It settled into the walls, into the boards underfoot, into Elias himself. He didn't remember the last time something cooking here had carried more than the smell of beans or coffee. She set 2 bowls on the table. The meal was simple: boiled potatoes, bread, and the stew she'd been stirring. But the taste was layered, the wild herbs cutting through the heaviness. Elias took his time eating. When he glanced up, she was watching him in that quiet way she had. No smile, no expectation, just taking measure. He set his spoon down. "It's good," he said. Something flickered across her face, something close to relief, though it passed quickly. Later, while she cleaned the bowls, he rewrapped her ankle, replacing the old cloth with a fresh strip. The skin was no longer swollen, but the joint was still tender under his touch. He worked carefully, keeping the pressure even. In the quiet, a verse came to him, uninvited. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. He hadn't thought about those words in years, but here they were, threading themselves through the sound of cloth tightening under his fingers. Nalin looked at him once, as if she'd heard something without his saying it, then turned back to folding the old bandage. That night, the wind shifted again, bringing cooler air down from the mountains. Elias stood on the porch, listening to the change. Nalin stepped outside, blanket draped over her shoulders. She leaned against the rail, her gaze following the canyon's shadowed spine. "You've been here a long time?" she asked. "Long enough." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. The canyon was dark now, the stars starting to show above its rim. "It's quiet here," he said finally. "No one comes unless they mean to." Her eyes stayed on the horizon. "Quiet can be good, or it can be a place to hide." He didn't argue. Some truths didn't need defending. She went back inside first, leaving him alone with the wind. It brought the faintest hint of wood smoke from somewhere far off. Not his, not any rancher he knew. He stood there a long while, sorting the scents from the night air, the way a man sorts truth from talk. When he came in, Nalin had set a small bundle on the table. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were dried herbs. "For the coffee," she said, "helps with pain in the bones." Elias nodded once and set it beside the tin where he kept his grounds. He didn't ask how she knew the desert well enough to find this, or why she thought he might need it. He figured answers would come in their own time, if they came at all. The morning broke cool and sharp, the kind that made sound travel farther. Elias saddled the mare and took her along the north fence line, where the land sloped toward the canyon's narrower arm. The frost on the mesquite leaves had already melted in spots, leaving damp shadows in the dust beneath. Near the far corner post, something caught his eye, a depression in the earth that didn't match the hoof prints he knew. He dismounted, crouching low. The print was deep, the edges clean, wide-heeled, no spur marks. Whoever made it carried weight and knew how to walk a line without dragging. He followed the trail for a dozen paces until it veered off into the scrub. More prints appeared, spaced wide apart. Elias set his palm over one, measuring. Bigger than his own boot. Too deliberate to be a ranch hand. He straightened slowly, scanning the distance. No movement, no dust. But the air felt different, like the pause before a hawk dives. On the ride back, he stayed off the main trail, keeping the mare to the low ground where the sage grew thick. At the cabin, he unsaddled her in the lee of the shed, out of sight from anyone on higher ground. Inside, Nalin was grinding something in a small stone bowl. She looked up, catching the tension in his shoulders before he could hide it. "Something?" she asked. "Tracks," he said. "North line." Her hands stilled over the herbs. How close? Close enough. She went back to her work without another question, but her movements had changed. Quicker now, less casual. Elias stepped into the storage room and pulled out a small crate of old coffee tins. From each, he shook out a handful of bent nails, lengths of wire, and scrap metal. On the porch, he cut lengths of wire and looped them through the rims of the tins, tying them in pairs. By the time he was done, he had a dozen noisemakers ready. He set the first along the back trail, hanging it from a low branch where the wind wouldn't stir it, but a man's leg would. The rest went to the corners of the yard and near the fence gate. In the kitchen, he checked the sight on the Winchester, wiping the barrel with an oiled rag. Through the open window, he could see Nalin step outside, her eyes scanning the horizon before she walked to the herb plot behind the cabin. When he came out, she was crouched low, hands in the soil. "You plantin'?" he asked. "Not yet," she said, "making sure nothing's been taken." It struck him then that she, too, was checking for signs, not of weather or soil, but of people. She was reading the ground the way he had that morning. He set the rifle down beside the porch rail. "You ever been hunted before?" Her gaze lifted to his, and in the stillness that followed, he had his answer without hearing a word. That night, the noisemakers hung silent. Elias sat on the porch with the rifle across his knees, eyes on the north. The moon came up over the ridge, washing the land in pale light. He could see far, but not far enough to know what was coming. Nalin stepped out once, a blanket over her shoulders, and stood beside him. She didn't ask if he'd seen anything. She just looked out over the same land, her breathing slow, as if she'd already measured the distance between herself and whatever lay beyond it. When she went back inside, Elias stayed put. The wire along the north fence hummed once in the wind, then stilled. The next morning came with a thin frost on the ground and a sky so clear it looked cut from glass. Elias was outside early, running a hand over the mare's neck before tightening the cinch. Nalin stepped out, her blanket pulled tight, the cold painting color into her cheeks. "You ride every morning?" she asked. "Most," he said, checking the bit. "You?" She shook her head. "Walked more than I rode. Easier to leave no trail that way." He glanced up at her, but didn't press. By mid-morning, the two of them were behind the cabin, fixing a section of wire fence where last summer's windstorm had twisted the posts. Elias showed her how to stretch the wire without breaking it, how to wedge a rock under the post for leverage. Her hands were quick, stronger than he expected. In the afternoon, she led him to a patch of scrub south of the cabin, where sage grew thick and wild, mint clung to the damp edge of a wash. She knelt in the dirt, showing him which leaves to pick and which to leave for regrowth. Her voice stayed low, more a part of the wind than apart from it. Back at the cabin, she brewed the mint with a few dried petals of something yellow. The steam curled in the cold air, carrying a smell that was sharp at first, and then soft, like a memory he couldn't place. "Good for the chest," she said, handing him the cup. He took a sip. It was bitter in a way that woke him. The heat, cutting through the chill, settled in his bones. They didn't speak much over the next hours. She moved inside, mending the strap of her moccasin, while he worked the edge of the porch roof where last winter's snow had bowed the boards. The rhythm of tools and small motions filled the day. That evening, she set a clay bowl on the table with strips of yucca soaked in water. "For rope," she said when he looked at it. She split the fibers with her thumbnail, twisting them into a line strong enough to hold a horse. In return, he showed her the saddle shed. He picked out a small sorrel gelding, young but not green, and talked her through the knots for the lead rope. She listened with the same focus she gave to everything, watching twice, trying once, getting it right the first time. The sun was dropping toward the canyon rim when she said, "You keep your rifle near the porch every night." He didn't deny it. "Tracks don't walk themselves." "Could be gone by now." "Could be closer," he said. She didn't answer, but later, when he came in for the night, he noticed the latch on the back window was locked from the inside, something he rarely bothered with. After supper, she stepped outside to look at the stars. He followed, curious. She pointed to the sky with a hand wrapped in the blanket. "That's the North Star. You keep it to your left, the river's a day away. Keep it to your right, 2 days to the mountains." "You travel by that?" "All my life," she said simply. They stood in silence for a while, the sky spread wide above them. Elias could feel the quiet tightening between them, not the kind that holds people apart, but the kind that draws them closer. Inside, he set his rifle in the corner by the bed and checked the box of cartridges on the shelf. Full. Within reach. Outside, the noisemakers hung still, but the air carried a weight he couldn't name. It was just past noon when the wind shifted warm, carrying the smell of juniper and something faintly metallic. Elias had been splitting mesquite logs by the shed when Nalin came around the corner with her hair tied back and a small clay pot in her hands. "I'll need to use your fire," she said. He nodded toward the hearth. "Go ahead." Inside, she crushed dried berries into the pot, mixing them with water until they bled dark red. The scent was bitter, almost like rust. She stirred slowly, her eyes fixed on the swirl. "This is for wounds that don't close on their own," she said without looking up. He leaned against the doorframe. "You've had to use it before?" Her hand paused, the spoon lifting mid-circle. "Yes." The quiet stretched until he spoke again. "What's coming after you, Nalin?" She set the spoon down. The sound it made against the pot was too loud in the small room. "Not the law," she said, "not exactly." He waited. "There was a man," she continued, "Clay Rook, came with a crew 2 winters ago, said they were surveying for a new settlement, brought maps, papers with seals on them. My people thought he was from the government." Elias could already feel the turn in the story. "They stayed through the spring, mapping the canyon. Then the wells started to go dry. Water went somewhere else, into their barrels, down their pipes. My uncle followed the line and found it led to a new channel they'd cut through the stone, straight to a holding tank on Rourke's land." She glanced at him now, her voice steady but low. "When the council confronted him, he laughed, said we were on land that wasn't ours to keep, said water was wealth and he had the deed to it." Elias felt the old weight in his chest, the kind that came from knowing exactly what men like that could do, and what they'd call it to make it sound clean. "By summer," she went on, "families began to leave. No water, no crops. Rourke brought wagons, offered to relocate anyone who stayed. I was one of them. We didn't know where he meant to take us until the second day out, east, away from the canyon, away from home." She didn't need to tell him how she got away. The fact she was here was enough. "And he's still looking," Elias said. "He can't let we go," she replied. "I know where the cut is. I know how to close it." The wind picked up outside, rattling one of the tin alarms along the fence. Elias's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to her. "You think he'd come all the way here?" "He doesn't care where," she said. "Not if it means keeping what he's taken." Elias moved to the table, pulling out the small map of his land he kept folded in the bottom drawer. He pointed to the canyon's north arm. "If he comes, it'll be through here. Hard to see a rider until he's close." Nalin stepped beside him, her shadow falling across the paper. "Then that's where you watch," she said. Something in her tone, calm, certain, settled into him like a decision already made. He folded the map, slipped it back into the drawer, and reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. The wood was warm under his hand, like it had been waiting. The air that night carried a bite sharp enough to turn breath into pale ribbons. Elias sat on the porch with his back against the post, Winchester laid across his knees. Beyond the yard, the desert rolled away in waves of shadow, each ridge darker than the last. The noisemakers hung silent in the stillness. Not even the wind touched them. That quiet should have been comfort, but it only made him more aware of every creak in the wood beneath him. He didn't hear the cabin door until it was already open. Nalin stepped out, wrapped in a blanket so thin he could see her outline in the lantern light. She didn't say anything, just crossed to where he sat and lowered herself beside him. The blanket shifted as she moved, and then half of it was draped over his shoulders. "You'll freeze out here," she said softly. "Better than sleeping through trouble." They sat like that for a while, watching the pale wash of moonlight creep across the canyon rim. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, the sound lifting and falling before fading into the cold. "I used to think," she said after a time, "that if I kept moving, the danger couldn't catch me." Elias glanced at her. The light caught her profile, the set of her jaw, the stillness in her eyes. "And now?" he asked. Now, I think it doesn't matter how far you run if you don't have somewhere worth stopping." He looked away before she could see the way that struck him. The tin by the north fence clinked once, faint but clear. His head snapped toward the sound. Silence followed, too much of it. He eased the rifle up, the motion slow and practiced. Nalin's hand brushed his arm. "It's only the wind." "Not tonight," he murmured. The minutes stretched. No rider appeared. No dust rose in the moonlight. Finally, he set the rifle back across his knees, but his shoulders stayed tense. She leaned slightly against him then, her weight light but steady. He didn't shift away. The warmth through the shared blanket was enough to remind him there was still life worth guarding on this porch. "You believe God sees us out here?" she asked quietly. Elias was slow to answer. "Maybe. Or maybe he just waits to see what we do with what we've been given." Her lips curved in the faintest smile. "And what have you been given?" He thought about it longer than he meant to. "Tonight, a reason to stay awake." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Then I'll keep you company." They stayed like that until the lantern inside burned low and the stars shifted overhead. When she finally stood, she left the blanket draped over him without a word. After she went inside, Elias reached for the box of cartridges he kept under the porch rail, setting them in a neat line beside him. His eyes never left the north fence. Somewhere beyond that black ridge, men were moving. He could feel it.
If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The first sign wasn't the sound of hooves, it was the hawk. It rose from the north fence line in a sudden arc, wings flashing bronze in the late sun. Elias had been watching that stretch for days, and when the bird spooked, he knew the reason. By the time the hoofbeats reached the yard, he was already standing on the porch, the Winchester resting easy in his hands. 4 riders came in slow from the ridge, dust clinging to their coats, the low light turning their hats into silhouettes. The lead man, Holly, sat tall in the saddle, a long coat swaying over his boots. His eyes were hard, scanning the place as though it already belonged to him. They stopped 20 yards out. No one spoke. The air was dry enough to hear the leather creak under their weight. Elias didn't step out into the open. Instead, he shifted so the porch post cut his outline in half. To most, it would look like casual leaning, but any man who'd traded fire knew it was a shield. Holly's gaze drifted to the yard. The lines of the cabin, the slant of the porch roof, all ordinary.
But somewhere in that stillness, there was a wrongness he couldn't name. For the viewers who'd been paying attention, it wasn't wrongness, it was the trap. The angles Elias had checked, the open space where a man could crossfire from the kitchen window. He hadn't just been waiting these past nights, he'd been building a box, and the Holly crew had just ridden into it. The horse under Holly shifted, stamping at the dust. The leader reached up, thumb pushing the brim of his hat back just enough to reveal pale eyes and a faint smile. "You Colter?" he asked. Elias didn't answer right away. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, letting the silence do its work. "Who's asking?" A flicker of irritation crossed Holly's face. "Name's not important. We're here for someone." Elias's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "That right?" Holly leaned forward in the saddle. "Apache woman. Came through here. Figure you've seen her." The moment settled like dust. This was the point where talk would either move aside for steel or stop the day from spilling blood. Elias knew which way the wind was pushing, and he also knew there wasn't any way to walk this back now. Elias kept his weight evenly on both feet, the rifle held just low enough to keep the trigger in easy reach. "Can't help you," he said flatly. The words were like a gate shutting. Holly's jaw worked slow, as if he were chewing on the reply before letting it out. Careful, old man. We're holding papers say she's wanted for government transport east, resettlement order. He held up a folded sheet, the edge catching the light. Elias didn't even glance at it. A piece of paper couldn't shoot him, and it couldn't tell him anything he didn't already know. Inside the cabin, Nalin's shadow shifted against the curtain. She didn't come closer to the window. Elias had told her not to. There was a back door, a slope into the mesquite if she needed to vanish, but she stayed where she was. Hawley's gaze swept toward the cabin door, and for just a heartbeat, his eyes lifted higher. To the thin cord Elias had strung days ago between porch beam and mesquite branch. To most, it looked like nothing but a frayed length of old twine. To anyone who knew the signs, it meant you were being watched from more than one place. The viewers, the ones who'd been following Elias's quiet preparations, would see it too. That bit of fishing line wasn't for decoration. It was part of the crossfire net. Elias didn't intend to be a lone target. "You sure you want to make this your fight?" Hawley's voice was calm, but the weight behind it pressed heavy. Elias let his eyes sweep the four men, noting the bulge of a spare cylinder in one's coat, the telltale raw spot on another's hand from a new revolver grip. These weren't ranch hands, they were hunters, paid hunters. "I don't recall inviting you past my fence," Elias said. Hawley gave a slow smile, one that didn't touch his eyes. "You really want to risk it all for some runaway? She ain't worth the trouble." Elias's voice was steady, the way stone is steady. "This land's mine. That's worth plenty." The words were deliberate. For the audience, it was clear Elias wasn't talking just about dirt and grass. Hawley shifted in the saddle. Last chance. Elias adjusted his stance, the rifle lifting just a breath higher. Somewhere inside, he felt the air change. The next moment would decide everything. And then, from behind the cabin door, came the soft, unmistakable sound of the latch lifting. The door swung just enough for the light from inside to spill across the porch boards. Nalin stepped out, the blanket she'd been wrapped in now hanging loose across her shoulders. Her injured ankle still made her gait uneven, but her back was straight, her chin high. The wind caught her hair, pulling dark strands across her face, but her eyes never left Hawley. "I'll go with you," she said, voice steady, measured, the way a person speaks when they've already decided their own fate. Elias didn't turn to look at her. He kept his gaze on Hawley, but his chest tightened. This wasn't fear in her tone, it was calculation. She was trading herself to stop blood from hitting the dirt. "You don't have to," Elias began. Nalin cut him off, her voice low but sharp. "If I leave, they'll have no reason to hurt you." Hawley's smirk returned. "See, she's got sense." For a moment, the air itself seemed to lean in. Elias could hear the faint tick of the porch lantern swinging against its hook, the distant cry of a hawk over the canyon rim. He thought of the verse his mother had read to him before the war, one he hadn't thought about in years. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." John 15:13. But that verse wasn't about surrender, it was about choosing. Elias finally turned toward her, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "You step off this porch, they'll break you down and erase every bit of who you are." Nalin's jaw tightened. "Better that than see you fall because of me." It hit him then. She was prepared to make the same kind of choice he thought he'd buried long ago, the kind you didn't walk back from. He stepped in front of her, blocking Hawley's view. Not happening. Hawley shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking. "You planning to stop 4 guns with that old Winchester?" Elias met his eyes without blinking. "I'm planning to stop you." The two men stared at each other across 20 feet of dust, and the line between them wasn't just in the sand. It was drawn in blood, principle, and something older than either of them. The wind carried the scent of sage from the garden behind the cabin. Nalin's hand brushed Elias's arm, just enough for him to know she was still there. Holly's smile faded. "Your funeral, old man." Elias's finger slid a fraction closer to the trigger. The silence between them was so taut it could have snapped under its own weight. Holly's right hand twitched toward the revolver at his hip, and that was all Elias needed. He didn't aim center mass, not yet. Instead, his Winchester came up in one smooth motion, the kind born of years, not days, and he squeezed off a single round. The shot cracked through the canyon like a whip. It slammed into the hardpan 6 inches to the right of Holly's boot. The impact spat a stinging cloud of grit across the man's shin and sent a sharp ricochet whining into the scrub. Every rider in Holly's crew stiffened. Not because Elias had missed, they all knew he hadn't, but because the warning was calculated down to the inch. "Next one goes where I choose," Elias said, his voice like gravel dragged over steel. From inside the cabin, the faint click of metal on wood sounded. Behind the curtain of the kitchen window, the backup rifle rested exactly where Elias had positioned it hours earlier, muzzle aimed low toward the rider's flank. A second line of fire. Holly's gaze flicked past Elias to the tree line, to the glint of an empty coffee tin swaying from a string, one of the perimeter alarms Elias had set. The realization was written across the outlaw's face. He was in someone else's arena. "You really think you can hole up and outlast us?" Holly said. Elias didn't bother answering. He only worked the Winchester's lever, chambering another round with a metallic snap that hung in the air longer than the shot had. Nalin stood behind him, silent, steady. Her presence wasn't fear, it was anchor. Elias knew every decision here would echo long after the dust settled. This wasn't about a quick trigger. It was about ending this without spilling blood, unless they forced his hand. The youngest rider shifted in his saddle, eyes darting to the wild herbs planted in the narrow strip of soil near the porch. Something in his expression softened, but he said nothing. Holly's jaw worked as he weighed the odds. 4 men, 1 target. But that target had the high ground, cover, and, worse, resolve. "Last chance," Elias said, raising the rifle just enough to make his point. The breeze carried the faint scent of rain, rare in this country, and for a second it felt like the whole desert was holding its breath. Holly didn't flinch at the rifle pointed his way, but his eyes were busy. They measured distances, angles, the tightening knuckles on Elias's trigger hand. They caught the faint swaying of more coffee tins on strings deeper in the mesquite, each one a trip line he hadn't spotted on the way in. This wasn't a simple catch-and-haul job anymore. It was a fight they could win only by paying for it in blood, maybe their own. He spat into the dust, a slow, deliberate act meant to buy time while he thought. "Not worth it," he muttered finally, voice flat. "Mount up." One by one the riders obeyed. Boots creaked against stirrups, leather groaned, and the metallic jingle of tack filled the heavy air. No one took their eyes off Elias. But the youngest, barely 20, risked one last glance toward the porch. His gaze lingered on Nalin, on the quiet way she stood beside Elias, on the line of herbs and wildflowers just starting to bloom in the hard soil. Something in his jaw shifted, like a question he'd carry with him long after the trail dust swallowed them. Holly reined his horse in close enough that Elias could smell the man's sweat under the leather and gun oil. "You made yourself a mark, Colter," he said low. "Men like me don't forget." Elias didn't blink. Neither do men like me." The riders turned north, the sound of their horses' hooves fading until it blended with the wind. Only then did Elias ease the pressure on the trigger. He didn't lower the rifle until the last shadow slipped over the ridge. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the quiet after lightning, when you wait to see where the fire will catch. Nalin's breath trembled, but her voice was steady. "They'll come back." Elias nodded. "Maybe." He glanced at her, the lines in his face deepened by the afternoon light. "But they'll think harder next time." His gaze dropped to her hands. Small, calloused from work, but clenched now in the fabric of her skirt. The urge to reach for them tugged at him, but he held it back. Not yet. Behind them, the cabin door swung gently in the wind, knocking once against the frame before settling. The desert smelled of dust and something faintly sweet, the promise of rain, still a long way off. The battle was over. The war had only just declared itself. Elias stepped back from the porch rail, lowering the Winchester. The weight of the rifle felt different now, not lighter, but settled, like a tool put back in its rightful place. Nalin was still standing where she'd been, the blanket slipping off one shoulder. Her eyes followed the empty horizon where the riders had gone, but she didn't seem to be watching for them anymore. "You could have let me go," she said at last. Elias rested the rifle against the wall and shook his head. "Wasn't an option." Her brows pulled together, not in anger, but in something closer to understanding. "You risked your life for me." He met her gaze. "You were ready to do the same." The words hung there, quiet but undeniable. Between them was no speech of gratitude, no trembling confession, only recognition. Nalin stepped forward, the porch boards creaking under her bare feet. She stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "I thought I'd run until I disappeared," she said softly. "Thought that was the only way to survive." "And now?" She looked out over the land, the lines of fence Elias had mended, the wild mint she'd planted, the mesquite swaying in the dry wind. "Now I think maybe there's more than one way to live." Elias didn't answer right away. His mind went back to another verse, one his father had read at the table when storms battered the roof. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer." Psalm 18:2. He didn't speak it aloud. Some words were meant to be carried, not shared. The evening light was shifting, painting the canyon rim in molten red. The danger was gone for now, but the ground beneath their feet still felt like a line drawn in sand. Nalin reached down and, without looking at him, found his hand. Her grip was steady, not clinging, not afraid, just sure. They stood like that for a long while, until the sun dropped low enough that the shadows began to pool across the porch. Inside, the kettle on the stove began to rattle as the water boiled. Elias gave her hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. "Come on," he said, the corner of his mouth almost bending into a smile. "Tea's ready." For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a choice. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The first weeks after the riders left felt like the space between breaths, quiet but not yet settled. Elias still walked the fence lines each morning, rifle slung across his shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon. Habit kept him sharp, but the tension had shifted. He was no longer bracing for an attack. He was tending to what he had chosen to keep. The land itself began to answer back. Small, stubborn changes showed in the soil. Sage pushed through the hardpan near the porch. Wild mint found its way into the shallow trench along the back corral. Yellow desert marigolds, flowers Elias hadn't seen here in years, scattered color along the fence where Nalin had pressed seeds into the earth with the side of her thumb. One afternoon, he took her to the back ridge for target practice. The sun was high, the air thin. He set an old tin can on a fence post and stepped back, showing her how to brace her stance, how to keep the stock snug against her shoulder. But more than anything, he talked about rules, where to aim, when to wait, and why you don't pull the trigger unless you've made the choice to live with it. She listened the way someone listens to a language they already half understand. In return, Nalin taught him to read the wind. Not just the way it rattled the dry brush, but its weight, its temperature, the subtle turns that meant a storm 2 days away, or the soft warning of something moving on 2 legs in the dark. They spent an hour on the ridge, eyes closed, letting the air speak. In town, Red Mesa had its say, too. Some nodded at Elias now, cautious but respectful. A few stopped to ask about the herbs growing on his porch rail. Others, the ones who had muttered before, still muttered, only now they did it with a little less conviction. Elias never answered them. He'd learned long ago that the desert didn't need him to speak for it. One evening, tightening the loose boards along the porch, he found himself whispering, not quite a prayer, not quite a thought. "Behold, I am doing a new thing. I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." Isaiah 43:19. The words didn't feel like hope exactly, more like recognition, that the thing was already happening whether anyone believed it or not. By mid-spring, the garden Nalin had started was holding its own. Sage by the porch, mint behind the cabin, and strips of creosote where the runoff from last month's rain had pooled. She tended it in the mornings before the sun grew hot, her hands quick and certain. Sometimes Elias watched from the porch, coffee in hand, letting the sight settle in his bones. For the first time in years, the quiet of the place didn't feel like an absence. It felt like the sound of something growing. Some evenings they would see dust on the far edge of the canyon, riders keeping their distance. Holly's crew, maybe, or others paid to look. They never came closer than a mile. Elias would watch until the dust faded, then go back to mending whatever the land had broken that week. In town, the story began to change shape. The whispers about the Apache woman and the quiet rancher no longer carried just suspicion. There was curiosity now. Some said the land had started blooming because of her hands. Others claimed Elias had struck some secret deal with the desert. Nobody said it too loud, but the fence line was green, and that was proof enough for some. For Elias, the days began to stack in a way they hadn't since before 1884. He still thought of Margaret and Daniel, always would. But the sharp edge of those memories had worn smooth. They no longer tore at him when he touched them. It wasn't replacing, it was mending. One morning he found Nalin on the porch, staring east. "You thinking of leaving?" he asked, voice even. She shook her head without looking away. "I'm thinking of planting mesquite by the creek," she said. That was her answer, and he understood it. Late that summer, they built a second chair for the porch. Not because she needed one. She often sat on the steps, elbows on her knees, but because Elias thought it was right. 2 chairs, side by side, under the same patch of shade. It made the place look like it was meant for 2. There was no sudden declaration between them, no loud vow to bind their lives together. They didn't need it. Their days said it for them. Her coffee already waiting on the railing at dawn. His jacket hung over the chair she used on cold evenings. Now and then, Nalin would hum while working in the garden. The tune carried in the dry air, soft but steady, and Elias would find himself pausing mid-task just to listen. The sound settled into the house, into the land, into him. One dawn, the air was cool enough to see steam rising from the 2 coffee cups on the porch rail. The horizon was still deep violet, the first light catching in the dust far off. Elias took his seat without a word. Nalin followed a moment later, pulling her blanket tight. The desert stretched before them, endless and bare in places, but here and there green pressed through the soil. It was the kind of morning that didn't promise safety, only possibility. Elias figured that was enough. They sat that way for a long time, not speaking, not needing to. The quiet was no longer a wall between them. It was a roof over their heads, the ground under their feet. If someone in town had asked Elias then what had changed, he might have said nothing and meant everything. Because the truth was simple. The desert hadn't softened. It had stayed as it was, harsh, exacting, unwilling to forgive mistakes. But it had made space for something else. And in that space, two people who had been hunted, by men, by grief, by the long years, had stopped running. The wind rose just before sunrise, carrying the scent of sage from the garden. Elias closed his eyes and breathed it in. A road cut through the desert in the distance, pale under the morning light. It didn't lead anywhere certain, but it led forward, and that was enough.